July 1941, Middle East Command Headquarters, Cairo. Lieutenant David Sterling limps through the sweltering heat, his leg still healing from a parachute accident that should have ended his military career. Instead of reporting to the medical tent, he scales a fence or slips under it, bypassing every chain of command between him and the top brass. His unauthorized idea, a small raiding force striking deep behind Axis lines in the vast North African desert. The generals listen with polite skepticism. Large armies win wars, not handfuls of men with jeeps and explosives. They give him token approval, 60 men, basic supplies, and the expectation he'll quietly disappear into the desert heat. 4 months later, Operation Squatter becomes a disaster. 65 men parachute into a desert storm. Fewer than 20 return. No enemy aircraft destroyed. The mockers feel vindicated. The unit teeters on disbandment. But Sterling makes one crucial pivot that changes everything. Within 15 months, his unauthorized desert unit would destroy over 250 enemy aircraft on the ground, more than entire bomber squadrons achieved in thousands of sorties. The question isn't how they did it. The question is why no one saw it coming. The summer heat of Cairo pressed down like a furnace as Lieutenant David Sterling approached the imposing gates of Middle East Command Headquarters. His right leg throbbed with each step, a constant reminder of the parachute training accident that had left him hospitalized for weeks while his unit shipped out without him. The doctors had been clear. Light duty, administrative work, maybe a desk job back in London. But Sterling had spent those long hospital days reading intelligence reports and studying maps of the North African theater, and what he saw there contradicted everything the British Army believed about desert warfare. The conventional wisdom was simple. Armies needed mass, armor, and air cover to advance across the western desert. Montgomery was marshaling hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, and entire squadrons of aircraft for the next push against Rommel. Every raid, every assault, every movement required vast logistical trains stretching back hundreds of miles to Alexandria and beyond. The desert was seen as an obstacle to be overcome through sheer industrial might. But Sterling had noticed something the generals missed. Between the coastal road where the main armies clashed and the deep desert interior lay hundreds of square miles of virtually empty terrain. The Axis held their forward airfields, Benghazi, Sirte, El Agheila, with minimal ground security, relying on distance and harsh conditions to protect them. German and Italian aircraft sat on those runways like sitting ducks, refueling Stukas and Messerschmitts that would return to hammer British positions the next morning. If a small, highly trained unit could penetrate that supposedly impregnable distance, the arithmetic of the air war would change overnight. The problem was getting anyone to listen. The British Army in 1941 operated on rigid hierarchical principles. Ideas flowed down from headquarters, not up from junior officers with unorthodox theories. Sterling had tried the official channels, written reports, formal requests for meetings, proper protocol through his regimental commanders. Each proposal disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery without response. Meanwhile, German aircraft continued their daily pounding of British positions, and Rommel's Africa Corps maintained their tactical mobility through uncontested air superiority. So Sterling decided to bypass the system entirely. On a blazing July afternoon, he approached the perimeter of Middle East Command from an unexpected angle. The main entrance buzzed with staff officers, dispatch riders, and visiting dignitaries, all following proper procedures, showing proper credentials, observing proper channels. Sterling found a section of fence away from the main traffic, assessed the height and the gap underneath, and chose the path that would get him inside fastest. Whether he went over or under didn't matter. What mattered was reaching someone with enough authority to understand what he was proposing. The headquarters building itself reflected the Army's faith in conventional approaches. Massive, imposing, designed to project authority and permanence. Inside, senior officers moved between briefing rooms where colored pins on enormous maps tracked the movements of entire divisions. The scale of everything, the planning, the logistics, the human resources, reinforced the assumption that wars were won through overwhelming force applied methodically across broad fronts. Sterling's appearance in those corridors, limping and unauthorized, represented everything the system was designed to filter out. But his timing was perfect. The British position in North Africa was deteriorating rapidly. Tobruk remained under siege. Rommel's forces had pushed British lines back toward Egypt, and conventional military wisdom wasn't producing the victories Churchill demanded. In that environment, even unorthodox ideas deserved a hearing. The pitch itself was elegantly simple. Instead of mounting massive air raids that required dozens of bombers, hundreds of crew members, and complex coordination with fighter escorts, why not put a handful of highly trained men directly onto the airfields under cover of darkness? The vast desert that protected Axis bases could become their weakness if approached correctly. A mobile unit, perhaps 30 or 40 men with jeeps and explosives, could cover distances impossible for conventional forces, strike multiple targets in coordinated attacks, and disappear back into the desert before dawn. The mathematics were compelling. Each Stuka or Messerschmitt destroyed on the ground was worth several aircraft shot down in air-to-air combat, because it also eliminated experienced pilots who were becoming increasingly irreplaceable. More importantly, destroying aircraft on the ground required no British aircraft losses, no bomber crews shot down over enemy territory, no fighter pilots killed in dogfights. The cost-benefit analysis was overwhelmingly favorable. But the real genius of Sterling's proposal wasn't tactical, it was psychological. He was asking for permission to prove that individual skill and audacity could achieve what industrial-scale operations had failed to accomplish. In an army increasingly dependent on material superiority, he was arguing for the primacy of human initiative. The generals listening to his unauthorized briefing recognized both the potential and the risk of what he was suggesting. After hours of discussion, questions, and skeptical examination of his maps and timing calculations, Middle East Command gave Sterling what he asked for: authorization to form L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. The name itself was partly deception. There was no SAS Brigade, and L Detachment suggested a much larger parent organization than actually existed. But the substance was real. 60 men, basic equipment, training facilities at Kabrit near the Nile, and permission to attempt what conventional forces had declared impossible. The selection process attracted volunteers from across the Middle East theater. Sterling wanted men who combined physical toughness with mechanical aptitude and psychological resilience. The training at Kabrit focused on desert survival, navigation by stars and sun compass, weapons proficiency with both British and captured Axis equipment, and the specialized skills needed for sabotage operations. Everything was designed around the assumption that small teams would operate independently behind enemy lines for days or weeks at a time. As summer turned to autumn, L Detachment prepared for its first operational test. Operation Squatter would launch on the night of November 16, 1941, timed to support a larger British offensive called Operation Crusader. The plan called for parachute insertion near the Axis airfields at Gazala and Timimi in Libya. Once on the ground, teams would approach the targets on foot, place explosives on parked aircraft, and withdraw to predetermined rendezvous points for extraction. But even as the men made final preparations, the weather turned ominous. Desert storms could ground aircraft, scatter parachute drops across miles of terrain, and turn precise navigation into deadly guesswork. The meteorological reports for November 16th showed increasing wind speeds and the possibility of severe weather across the drop zones. Sterling faced his first operational decision: proceed as planned and risk everything on weather conditions, or postpone and lose the element of surprise that his entire concept depended upon. The choice would determine not just the fate of Operation Squatter, but the future of special operations in the British Army. The wreckage of Operation Squatter scattered across the Libyan desert told a story Sterling refused to accept as final. Fewer than 20 men had reached the rendezvous points. Supply containers lay buried in sand dunes or hung shredded from thorn bushes. Not a single enemy aircraft had been touched. The parachute insertion that looked flawless on paper had proven catastrophically vulnerable to the desert's unpredictable weather patterns. As reports filtered back to Cairo, senior officers who had grudgingly approved the operation began drafting orders to disband L Detachment entirely. But Sterling saw something different in the failure. The concept remained sound. Small teams striking deep behind enemy lines could achieve disproportionate results. The problem wasn't the idea, it was the delivery method. Parachute drops required perfect weather, precise navigation by aircraft crews unfamiliar with desert conditions, and coordination between multiple elements that could fail at any point. The desert had taught him that complexity was the enemy of success, and his insertion method had been far too complex. The solution emerged through conversations with officers who had been operating in the deep desert since the war's early days. The long-range desert group had spent months mapping routes through supposedly impassable terrain, establishing fuel dumps hundreds of miles from the nearest road, and proving that specially equipped vehicles could cover vast distances across landscapes that defeated conventional forces. Their modified Chevrolet trucks and Ford utility vehicles carried extra fuel tanks, oversized radiators, and specialized navigation equipment that made them virtually independent of external support. More importantly, the LRDG had developed techniques for desert navigation that eliminated the guesswork plaguing parachute operations. Using sun compasses during daylight and star navigation after dark, their crews could locate specific coordinates across featureless terrain with accuracy measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. Their vehicles moved like ships across an ocean of sand, following invisible routes marked only on carefully annotated charts that recorded every landmark, every hazard, every source of water or fuel between Cairo and the front lines. Sterling proposed a partnership that would revolutionize both organizations' capabilities. The LRDG would provide transportation and navigation expertise, delivering SAS teams to within striking distance of target airfields. The SAS would provide the specialized sabotage training and equipment needed to maximize damage during brief raids. Instead of parachuting blindly into unknown terrain, teams would approach targets with precise knowledge of local conditions, escape routes, and defensive arrangements. The training regimen at Kabrit intensified accordingly. Men who had focused primarily on parachute techniques now spent hours learning vehicle maintenance, desert, survival, and the subtle art of navigation across terrain where a compass error of 5 degrees could mean death by dehydration. They practiced approach marches under simulated combat conditions, moving silently across rocky ground while carrying explosives and weapons. Physical conditioning emphasized endurance over short-term strength, recognizing that operations might require walking dozens of miles carrying heavy equipment. Lieutenant Jock Lewis emerged as the unit's master of applied destruction. A former Oxford rowing blue with an engineering background, Lewis understood that destroying aircraft required more than simply placing explosive charges randomly around enemy airfields. He studied aircraft construction manuals, identifying critical structural points where relatively small amounts of explosive could cause catastrophic damage. His experiments led to development of the Lewis bomb, a 1-pound charge combining plastic explosive with thermite incendiary mixture, designed to both shatter aircraft structures and ignite fuel systems. The Lewis bomb represented precision applied to destruction. Unlike conventional demolition charges that relied on brute force, Lewis had calculated exactly how much explosive energy was needed to rupture aircraft wing structures and fuel tanks. The thermite component ensured that damaged aircraft would burn completely, eliminating any possibility of repair. Each bomb weighed just enough to be carried easily by raiders moving on foot, but packed sufficient destructive power to eliminate a fighter or bomber worth tens of thousands of pounds and months of manufacturing time. Testing revealed the psychological dimensions of the new approach. During practice raids against mock-up targets, SAS teams discovered that approaching on foot after vehicle insertion created entirely different tactical opportunities than parachute drops. Instead of rushing to complete sabotage before dawn extraction, teams could observe target areas for hours, noting guard rotations, identifying the most valuable aircraft, and timing their attacks for maximum surprise. The luxury of reconnaissance transformed raids from desperate sprints into carefully orchestrated operations. December 1941 provided the first opportunity to test the revised concept under operational conditions. Intelligence reports indicated significant Axis aircraft concentrations at airfields near Sirte and Ajdabiya, staging areas for attacks against British positions approaching Benghazi. The targets were roughly 300 miles behind enemy lines, well beyond the range of conventional raids, but accessible to LRDG vehicles operating from hidden supply bases in the deep desert. The partnership between SAS and LRDG functioned exactly as Sterling had envisioned. LRDG navigators guided modified Chevrolet trucks across seemingly impossible terrain, using dead reckoning and celestial navigation to reach predetermined coordinates with remarkable precision. SAS teams rode as passengers during the approach phase, conserving energy for the foot marches that would bring them within striking distance of target airfields. The vehicles themselves became mobile supply bases, carrying water, ammunition, and medical supplies needed to sustain operations over several days. Approaching Sirte airfield on the night of December 8th, the raiders could see the silhouettes of German and Italian aircraft arranged in neat rows along the main runway. Junkers transport planes sat alongside Machi fighters and Stuka dive bombers, representing millions of marks worth of sophisticated military hardware protected by nothing more than a handful of sentries and a perimeter fence designed to keep out curious Bedouins rather than trained saboteurs. The attack itself unfolded with mechanical precision. Teams approached from multiple directions, placing Lewis bombs on aircraft with the highest operational value while avoiding unnecessary risks. Each explosion triggered secondary fires that illuminated the airfield like daylight, revealing the scope of destruction being inflicted on Axis aviation assets. Within 15 minutes, 24 aircraft had been reduced to burning wreckage, and the raiders were withdrawing into darkness before confused guards could organize effective pursuit. Similar attacks at Agadabiya and other targets produced comparable results. The revised insertion method had eliminated the vulnerabilities that doomed Operation Squatter while preserving the tactical advantages that made deep desert raiding attractive. By January 1942, L Detachment had validated its operational concept through repeated successful missions, destroying dozens of enemy aircraft at minimal cost in British casualties or equipment. The transformation extended beyond tactical success to strategic implications. German and Italian commanders now faced the unprecedented problem of defending rear area installations against attacks that could materialize anywhere along hundreds of miles of supposedly secure territory. Resources previously devoted to frontline operations had to be diverted to airfield security, reducing the combat power available for offensive operations against British positions. But the real revolution was conceptual. Sterling had proven that small, highly trained units using unconventional methods could achieve results beyond the reach of conventional forces employing traditional approaches. By the spring of 1942, the Desert War had acquired a new dimension that Axis commanders struggled to comprehend. Aircraft that had been considered safe hundreds of miles behind the front lines were disappearing in spectacular explosions that illuminated the night sky. Supply convoys moving along supposedly secure routes found themselves under attack from armed vehicles that materialized from empty desert and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. The neat operational maps that had previously defined the boundaries between friendly and hostile territory no longer reflected the reality of a conflict where small British units operated with impunity across vast expanses of North Africa. Sterling's expansion of SAS capabilities had evolved far beyond the original concept of airfield raids. Intelligence reports revealed lucrative targets throughout the Axis rear areas, fuel dumps containing thousands of gallons of precious petrol, ammunition stockpiles supporting frontline operations, communications installations coordinating movements between Tripoli and the forward positions. Each successful raid not only destroyed immediate military assets, but forced the enemy to divert resources toward protecting installations that had previously required minimal security. The transformation of SAS equipment reflected lessons learned through months of desert operations. The original partnership with the Long-Range Desert Group had proven invaluable for insertion and extraction, but operational experience revealed limitations in depending entirely on external transportation. SAS teams needed their own vehicles, platforms capable of carrying men, weapons, and supplies across hundreds of miles of hostile territory while providing firepower sufficient to engage enemy forces encountered during raids. The solution emerged through modification of standard British Army vehicles into specialized desert raiders. Willys Jeeps, originally designed for reconnaissance and light transport, were stripped of unnecessary weight and fitted with additional fuel tanks, extra water containers, and navigational equipment borrowed from LRDG experience. Most significantly, each Jeep received armament that transformed it from transport vehicle into mobile weapons platform. Twin Vickers K machine guns, normally used for aircraft defense, were mounted on swivel fixtures that allowed rapid engagement of targets in any direction. The Vickers K represented a revolution in ground combat firepower. Designed for aerial use, the guns fired standard .303 ammunition at nearly 900 rounds per minute, a rate of sustained fire that no infantry weapon could match. Two guns mounted on a single Jeep could deliver 1,800 rounds per minute, creating a cone of destruction capable of suppressing enemy positions, destroying soft-skinned vehicles, and inflicting catastrophic damage on parked aircraft. The psychological effect was equally important. The distinctive sound of Vickers K fire became associated with SAS raids across the western desert. Ammunition supply for sustained operations required careful calculation. Each Vickers K gun consumed ammunition at rates that would exhaust conventional infantry loads within minutes of sustained firing. SAS Jeeps carried thousands of rounds in specially designed containers that protected ammunition from sand and moisture while allowing rapid reloading during combat. The weight of ammunition, combined with fuel, water, and other essential supplies, pushed each vehicle to its operational limits while maintaining the mobility necessary for deep desert penetration. Navigation remained the critical skill that distinguished successful raids from disasters. The desert offered few landmarks recognizable to conventional map reading, and compass errors that seemed trivial over short distances became fatal when multiplied across hundreds of miles of travel. SAS navigators adopted LRDG techniques while developing their own innovations suited to rapid movement across contested terrain. Sun compasses provided accurate direction during daylight hours, while star navigation allowed night movement with precision measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. The raid on Sidi Hanaish airfield on July 26, 1942, demonstrated the full potential of evolved SAS tactics. 18 Jeeps carrying 72 men approached the target after a night march of 80 kilometers across terrain that conventional forces would have considered impassable. Each vehicle mounted 4 Vickers K guns, 2 primary weapons, and 2 spares to ensure continuous fire despite mechanical failures or battle damage. The total firepower available to the raiding force exceeded that of an entire infantry company, while maintaining the mobility to appear at any point along hundreds of miles of vulnerable coastline. The approach phase revealed the sophistication that SAS operations had achieved since the disasters of Operation Squatter. Advanced reconnaissance had identified German and Italian aircraft positions, security arrangements, and optimal approach routes. The raiders moved in 2 columns separated by sufficient distance to avoid mutual interference while maintaining communication through prearranged signals. Each Jeep crew knew their specific targets and withdrawal routes, eliminating the confusion that had plagued earlier operations. The attack itself lasted 15 minutes, but achieved destruction that would have required hours of conventional bombing to accomplish. Vickers K fire swept across lines of parked aircraft, while Lewis bombs detonated among high-value targets identified during reconnaissance. Messerschmitt fighters worth hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks became flaming wreckage within seconds of the first shots. Junkers transport aircraft loaded with supplies for frontline units contributed their fuel and cargo to fires that would burn for hours after the raiders disappeared into darkness. The tactical results spoke for themselves. 37 enemy aircraft destroyed, fuel and ammunition dumps eliminated, airfield facilities damaged beyond immediate repair. The cost to SAS forces was minimal, 3 Jeeps lost to enemy fire, and 2 men killed during the withdrawal. The exchange ratio represented exactly the kind of asymmetric warfare that Sterling had envisioned, where small numbers of highly trained men with appropriate equipment could achieve results beyond the reach of conventional forces employing traditional methods. But the strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate destruction. Axis commanders now faced the reality that no installation within 300 miles of the front lines could be considered secure. Resources previously available for offensive operations had to be diverted to rear area security. Aircraft that might have supported Rommel's advance toward Alexandria were instead grounded at heavily defended bases or withdrawn to airfields in Sicily and southern Italy. The initiative in the Desert War was shifting toward the British not through massive frontal assaults, but through the cumulative effect of dozens of pinprick raids that disrupted enemy operations across the entire theater. Intelligence reports reaching Cairo painted a picture of growing Axis concern about British special operations. German and Italian units were being pulled from frontline positions to guard supply lines and airfields. Rommel's logistical situation, always precarious due to the distances involved in desert warfare, was deteriorating as SAS attacks eliminated fuel and ammunition stockpiles faster than they could be replaced through the vulnerable Mediterranean supply routes. The psychological dimension proved equally significant. German pilots who had grown accustomed to operating from secure rear bases now faced the constant possibility that their aircraft might be destroyed while they slept. Ground crews worked under increased security measures that slowed maintenance and reduced operational readiness. The confidence that had characterized Axis operations during their advance toward Egypt was being eroded by an enemy that struck without warning and disappeared before effective countermeasures could be implemented. By the end of 1942, L Detachment had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. The morning after Sidi Hanaish, Sergeant Jeff Duvivier stood among the smoldering wreckage of 37 enemy aircraft and felt something he had not experienced since joining Sterling's unit: complete vindication. The same staff officers who had dismissed the SAS as piratical warfare, unsuitable for professional soldiers, were now studying raid reports with the intensity of converts examining scripture. The numbers were undeniable, brutal in their clarity. 37 aircraft destroyed in 15 minutes by 18 jeeps. 0 aircraft destroyed during Operation Squatter despite 65 men and months of preparation. The contrast exposed everything wrong with conventional military thinking and everything right about Sterling's radical approach. Duvivier remembered the mockery that had greeted their early training at Cabrit. Regular Army officers visiting the camp had watched SS recruits practicing desert navigation and vehicle maintenance with expressions of barely concealed contempt. Real soldiers, they implied, fought in formation with proper support and clear chains of command. They did not sneak around the desert like Bedouin raiders, mounting machine guns on jeeps and fabricating homemade explosives in makeshift workshops. The whispered comments about amateur theatricals and cowboys playing soldier had stung because they came from men whose own conventional methods had produced an unbroken series of defeats across North Africa. The transformation in attitudes had been swift and absolute. The same officers who had questioned SAS selection standards were now requesting detailed briefings on raiding techniques. Generals who had allocated minimal resources to Sterling's experiments were suddenly interested in expanding special operations throughout the Mediterranean theater. The institutional resistance that had nearly killed the SAS after Operation Squatter had evaporated in the face of operational results that spoke louder than any theoretical argument. But Duvivier understood that success had come through systematic attention to details that conventional forces either ignored or considered beneath their notice. The twin Vickers K guns that made SAS jeeps so effective had been scavenged from damaged aircraft and modified through countless hours of trial and error in the workshops at Cabrit. The mounting systems that allowed rapid traversal and accurate fire from moving vehicles had been fabricated by mechanics who understood that improvisation often produced better solutions than official procurement procedures. Each jeep represented a mobile arsenal carefully optimized for desert raiding. Beyond the primary armament of 4 Vickers K guns, every vehicle carried specialized equipment developed through months of operational experience. Navigation instruments included sun compasses, star charts, and dead reckoning logs that allowed accurate position finding across featureless terrain. Fuel capacity had been expanded through additional jerry cans and auxiliary tanks that extended operational range to over 400 miles without resupply. Water storage received equal attention, with multiple containers distributed throughout each vehicle to ensure survival even if combat damage eliminated primary supplies. The logistics of sustained raiding revealed complexities that armchair strategists never appreciated. Each Vickers K gun consumed ammunition at rates that would exhaust infantry loads within minutes of sustained combat. A 15-minute engagement like Sidi Hanaish required thousands of rounds per jeep, representing hundreds of pounds of additional weight that had to be carried across desert terrain that challenged vehicles even without combat loads. Ammunition containers had to protect cartridges from sand and moisture while allowing rapid reloading under combat conditions, requirements that demanded custom fabrication rather than standard military supplies. The Lewis bombs that made aircraft destruction so efficient represented similar attention to technical precision. Each 1-pound charge combined plastic explosive with thermite incendiary in proportions calculated to maximize both blast effect and fire damage. The plastic explosive shattered aircraft structures, while the thermite ignited fuel systems, ensuring complete destruction rather than repairable damage. Manufacturing the bombs required chemistry knowledge that went far beyond standard military demolitions training, with each batch tested to ensure consistent performance under varying temperature and humidity conditions. Training had evolved accordingly, transforming recruits from conventional soldiers into specialists capable of operating independently across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Navigation instruction emphasized practical skills over theoretical knowledge, teaching men to read terrain features invisible to untrained eyes and maintain accurate course plotting despite the magnetic anomalies and optical illusions that made desert travel so treacherous. Vehicle maintenance covered not just routine servicing, but emergency repairs using improvised materials, recognizing that mechanical failure hundreds of miles from base could mean death for an entire patrol. Weapons training went beyond simple marksmanship to include the complex coordination required for effective fire from moving vehicles. The Vickers K guns delivered devastating firepower, but required precise timing and ammunition discipline to avoid the mechanical failures that could leave a jeep defenseless during combat. Gunners learned to engage targets while compensating for vehicle movement, wind conditions, and the limited ammunition supplies that made every burst count toward mission success or failure. The human cost of this specialized warfare appeared in details that official reports rarely captured. Duvivier's boots had disintegrated during a 60-mile forced march after a vehicle breakdown, leaving him to complete the journey barefoot across terrain that shredded feet within hours. Water rationing during extended operations meant constant thirst that affected judgment and physical performance in ways that could prove fatal during critical moments. Sleep deprivation from night movements and daylight concealment created exhaustion levels that tested mental resilience as severely as any enemy fire. Yet these hardships paled beside the satisfaction of proving that unconventional methods could achieve results beyond the reach of conventional forces. The aircraft destroyed at Sidi Hanaish represented more than tactical success. They symbolized vindication for every innovation, every improvisation, every refusal to accept that established procedures represented the limits of military possibility. Each burning Messerschmitt validated months of experimentation with equipment modifications, training techniques, and operational concepts that senior officers had dismissed as impractical fantasies. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual raids. Intelligence reports indicated that Axis commanders were diverting significant resources toward rear area security, pulling combat units from frontline positions to guard supply lines and airfields that had previously required minimal protection. The psychological effect was equally important. German and Italian forces now operated under constant awareness that British raiders could appear anywhere along hundreds of miles of supposedly secure territory. The cumulative damage inflicted by SAS operations was approaching levels that would have required massive conventional bombing campaigns to achieve. Over 150 enemy aircraft had been destroyed on the ground during the 6 months since the shift from parachute to vehicle insertion, with corresponding losses in fuel supplies, ammunition stockpiles, and transportation assets. The cost in British casualties and equipment remained minimal, creating the kind of asymmetric exchange that conventional military doctrine insisted was impossible to sustain. But Duvivier recognized that success had created new vulnerabilities. The Axis was adapting, improving airfield defenses, and developing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize SAS tactics. The element of surprise that had made early raids so devastating was diminishing as the enemy forces learned to anticipate and respond to unconventional attacks. The telegram arrived at Middle East Command on January 23, 1943, carrying news that would reshape the future of British Special Operations. Lieutenant Colonel David Stirling had been captured in Tunisia during a reconnaissance mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. The man who had scaled the fence at Cairo headquarters 18 months earlier to pitch his unauthorized desert unit was now a prisoner of war, bound for interrogation centers where German intelligence officers would attempt to extract every detail of SAS organization, tactics, and planned operations. The loss struck at the emotional center of the unit in ways that extended far beyond operational considerations. Stirling had been more than a commanding officer. He was the intellectual architect whose vision had transformed a handful of volunteers into the most effective raiding force in the Mediterranean theater. His capture represented not just the removal of leadership, but the potential compromise of methods that had given British forces their first sustained tactical advantage in the Desert War. Every SAS man understood that German interrogators would focus intensively on the technical details that made their raids so devastatingly effective. But the organizational structure that Stirling had built proved more resilient than enemy intelligence analysts anticipated. Command passed seamlessly to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Blair Mayne, whose leadership style differed dramatically from Stirling's visionary approach, while maintaining the operational effectiveness that had made the SAS legendary throughout the Western Desert. Where Stirling had been the creative innovator, constantly developing new concepts and techniques, Mayne was the consummate battlefield commander who understood how to extract maximum performance from men and equipment under combat conditions. Mayne's background as an international rugby player had instilled disciplines that translated directly to special operations leadership. He understood team dynamics, the psychology of performance under pressure, and the critical importance of maintaining morale during extended periods of physical and mental strain. His personal fearlessness in combat, demonstrated repeatedly during raids where he led from the front rather than directing from rear positions, earned respect from men who had grown accustomed to officers who treated war as an intellectual exercise rather than a physical confrontation with death. The transition occurred at a moment when Axis countermeasures were beginning to reduce the effectiveness of SAS operations. German and Italian commanders had analyzed raid patterns, identifying the techniques and equipment that made British attacks so successful. Airfield defenses had been strengthened with additional sentries, improved lighting systems, and rapid response forces positioned to intercept raiders during their withdrawal phases. Supply convoys traveled with heavier escorts, and rear area installations received security upgrades designed specifically to counter the infiltration methods that SAS teams had perfected. More significantly, the Axis was developing tactical responses that exploited the fundamental vulnerability of all special operations: their dependence on surprise and mobility rather than sustained firepower. German reconnaissance aircraft began systematic patrols of desert areas, previously considered too remote for military activity, searching for vehicle tracks, supply caches, and base camps that might reveal SAS operational patterns. Radio intercept stations monitored frequencies that might carry communications between raiding teams and their supporting elements, hoping to predict future operations through analysis of transmission schedules and message content. The strategic context was also shifting in ways that reduced the relative importance of deep desert raiding. Allied forces were gaining material superiority across the Mediterranean theater, with massive reinforcements arriving from Britain and the United States. The industrial capacity that Stirling had initially sought to neutralize through unconventional tactics was now being matched and exceeded through conventional production methods. Aircraft destroyed in SAS raids were being replaced faster than small teams could eliminate them, reducing the cumulative effect that had made early operations so strategically significant. Yet under Mayne's leadership, the SAS adapted and evolved rather than simply continuing established patterns that were becoming less effective. The unit began expanding operations beyond the Western Desert into new theaters where conventional forces face different challenges requiring specialized solutions. European operations demanded techniques and equipment far removed from desert warfare, forcing rapid development of urban infiltration methods, cold weather survival skills, and coordination with resistance movements operating under completely different conditions than Bedouin guides in North Africa. The expansion represented vindication of Sterling's fundamental insight that small, highly trained units could achieve disproportionate results through methods unavailable to conventional forces. The specific techniques developed for desert raiding, vehicle-borne insertion, precision navigation, explosive sabotage, rapid withdrawal proved transferable to entirely different environments with appropriate modifications. The organizational principles that had made L detachment effective in Libya and Egypt worked equally well when applied to operations in Italy, France, and eventually northwestern Europe. Training evolved accordingly, incorporating lessons learned through 15 months of combat operations while preparing for missions that would demand entirely new skill sets. The workshops at Cabrit that had produced Lewis bombs and modified Vickers K mountings now focused on developing equipment for operations behind German lines in occupied Europe. Parachute training, abandoned after the disasters of Operation Squatter, resumed with improved techniques and better coordination between aircrew and ground teams. Language instruction and cultural briefings prepared SAS personnel for operations among civilian populations, rather than the empty landscapes that had characterized desert warfare. The numerical legacy of the North African campaign provided objective validation for concepts that had initially been dismissed as impractical fantasies. Official records credited the SAS with destroying over 250 enemy aircraft during the 15 months before Sterling's capture, along with hundreds of vehicles, dozens of supply dumps, miles of railway track, and countless tons of fuel and ammunition. The cost in British casualties and equipment remained remarkably low, creating exactly the kind of asymmetric exchange that conventional military doctrine claimed was impossible to sustain over extended periods. But the real transformation extended beyond statistical measures to fundamental changes in how military organizations approach the relationship between tactical innovation and strategic effectiveness. The success of SAS operations had demonstrated that individual creativity and small unit initiative could achieve results that massive industrial mobilization had failed to accomplish. The implications extended far beyond desert warfare to questions about military organization, resource allocation, and the role of unconventional thinking in solving complex operational problems. Sterling himself, writing years later from the perspective of post-war reflection, would identify the failed parachute drop of Operation Squatter as the crucial moment that forced development of the vehicle-based tactics that made all subsequent success possible. The willingness to abandon failed methods and rapidly adopt new approaches had been more important than any specific technical innovation or tactical refinement. The lesson applied equally to individuals and institutions. Adaptability mattered more than initial accuracy, and the capacity to learn from failure was more valuable than the ability to avoid it entirely. In a war dominated by massive armies, industrial production, and technological sophistication, a handful of men with modified jeeps had proven that ideas and courage remained decisive factors in military success.